Good morning, everybody. My name is Rosalia, and I am the Director for Strategy and Operations in Emerging Markets for Everex, based here in Bangkok, Thailand. Today, I want to talk about why Everex, and specifically, I guess, when I am trying to convince you why Everex, I can give you a bit about my story and how I ended up at Everex, because I think it's indicative of why so many of you came out to support Everex. Before I joined Team Everex, I wore a couple of hats. I was a corporate lawyer in New York and Paris for a number of years, mainly working on securities and capital markets. And then I thought, I'm going to join the United Nations because I really want to make a difference in the world. And so with the United Nations, I worked for about a decade in different capacities, but I worked in my most recent capacities, I was working on humanitarian disasters, both man-made and natural disasters. So you might have heard of a few of them in the news. I was in Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake. I worked in Nigeria in the recent conflict there. I worked in Central African Republic, the Congo, Sierra Leone, Liberia, a lot of conflicts actually, and a lot in West and Central Africa. And then I was later the coordinator for the Ebola response in Guinea. And my latest job was the head of analysis for the Syria crisis based in Lebanon. And from this vantage point of working in some of the most challenging contexts in the world, and working with, some of people in the world who are often neglected by, basic access to services, and ultimately being the principal provider for such services, I just knew over the course of the decade there had to be a better way to bring better services and better products to people who need it and deserve it arguably the most. And that's how I kind of came across Everex. Everex had said, we want to bank the unbanked. And I just want to put a couple of key facts to what that means. There's about 8 billion people in the world, and 2 billion of them do not have access to financial services. What does it mean to not have access to financial services? And this is where I would say maybe we'd start at a more personal journey. So my mother happens to be a Filipino woman. And she was from the north of Philippines, a very rural area. Her parents are rice farmers. My grandparents are rice farmers. And when she finished high school, she moved to Manila, the capital city. And in order for her parents to pay those school fees, the easiest way for them to do that, because they were part of the unbanked, they don't have access to financial services. Granted, this was also the early 80s. They had to find a physical way of transporting her school fees to Manila to pay the school fees. My mother later on, after she finished her undergraduate school, she managed to get a scholarship to a university in Washington, D.C., which is where she met my father. And when she was in Washington, D.C., the next question was, well, how am I going to pay my rent? And how am I going to pay, maybe not the school fees because she's on a scholarship, but costs associated with being a student. Now, trying to get the cash from the northern Philippines via Manila, all the way to Washington, D.C., in the early 1980s proved to be an extremely onerous task. What's interesting is that you fast forward to 2018, and this is the second factoid, it still remains that the fastest way to get money from Manila to Washington, D.C. is to fly it there. These are two of the problems, or the key issues that Everex looks to remedy, using and leveraging blockchain technology. It is no longer the case when you institute blockchain technology into the financial services system. It is no longer the case that the fastest way to get it there is to fly it. I myself have transferred money using blockchain. Everex has had a pilot transferring blockchain across borders, and as my colleague earlier said, it's an instantaneous settlement. In addition to being an instantaneous settlement, no longer do you have to rely on third parties and intermediaries who cut 5%. If you're lucky, if you have access to existing financial services, 5%, 7%, 13%. I live in Bangkok. One of my banks is in America. When I pay my monthly rent, there's at least 13% that's cut off the top from that transaction fee. Sorry. So that's kind of my personal journey and how it relates even in my day-to-day life of why I joined Everex. So, but then again, beyond just transfer of money, as my colleague mentioned earlier, we are a financial payments platform. We're trying to create financial services across a platform. So beyond just moving money across borders, what does that mean? After one finishes grad school, so after my mother finishes grad school, she gets married. What's the first thing married people want to do? They usually want to buy a house. How do you access a house if you don't have access to financial services? Luckily at that point, she did have access to financial services because she was living in a place where she had access to it. She goes to a bank, they give her a mortgage. With that mortgage, able to buy a house. Later on, have children, myself included. Now we have to pay our school fees. Now we have to go to university. We have to go to grad school. But because in that first generation we had access to financial services, those type of challenges where literally somebody is trying to physically carry money from the northern Philippines to Washington, D.C. are no longer the reality of my life, because I am one of the lucky 6 billion people who have access to financial services. So what do I do at Everex? My title is 5 different words, but what does that effectively mean? I'm in charge of the financial inclusion portfolio. Why? Because I spent the last decade working in frontier markets, and I have a lot of experience in trying to onboard those living in really last mile communities. So what does this mean on a day-to-day? I spend a lot of time linking up with my former cohorts, my network, working at the United Nations and with large international NGOs, to sway them to upgrade and join 2018 and upgrade their technology and let them, and basically most of it's an education session. I tell them about what blockchain is, what it has the capacity to do, what not only financial inclusion means, but what financial exclusion means. So that's a lot of the initial work that we do, but ultimately, and I'm feeling pretty positive. I've had a lot of really encouraging conversations. There are at least 5 different UN agencies across the world that have been piloting aspects of blockchain into their existing programming. There are myriad use cases. Only now we're starting to scratch the surface, but myriad use cases for blockchain, particularly in financial services. I can give a couple of examples. One is what's called cash-based transfers. This is anybody who's watching this video who's familiar with humanitarian aid. As of today, how humanitarian assistance is literally the bringing of goods and services to a particular place. More often than not, we fly it in. So again, fastest way to move goods and services to people who need it most is to literally fly it there. I was encouraged to see that certain UN agencies, particularly the United Nations Food Program, decided that, well, maybe that's not the fastest way to do things. And in Syria, they instituted a blockchain to move money from United Nations coffers to ultimate beneficiaries to allow them to decide what they wanted to buy and what they needed most in real time, without any of the intermediary costs and in an instantaneous way. Other use cases include putting identities on blockchain. As a caveat, one of the barriers to accessing financial services right now are what are called Know Your Client, KYC, and Anti-Money Laundering Statutes, AML. So KYC, AML, you might hear this a lot. And what this effectively means is banks and all financial institutions and governments and me and you, frankly, we want to know where money originates and how it's being spent. Why do we want to know this? Because we know that without certain oversight, money and finances can be used to fairly different and nefarious ends. And that's not the kind of world I think any of our community wants to see. We don't want to necessarily see money being used, money being created by an illicit industry or by exploiting people. We also don't want to see money spent towards exploiting people and also towards illicit industries, right? I think we can all agree on that. But that KYC AML barrier requires that first you have to know who your client is, right? You have to actually, and as of today, the only way to do that is to physically walk into a bank, have the person there, sign a document, and then leave. Again, about 2 billion people, and I would argue more, do not have access in terms of within walking distance to walk into an average retail banking establishment and do this. Plus, we also know that technological advances have made it such that there are ways to verify identity beyond physically walking into a bank and shaking the hands of your local banker. We have biometric data that can access this. We have pretty reliable streams, and the blockchain, as we know, is a pretty reliable place whereby you can keep unique identifiers to unique people so that you can overcome some of these KYC AML. And that's also part of what we're experimenting with looking at. But again, beyond access to payments and beyond kind of access to a wider financial services in the day-to-day lives of people living outside of financial services, what this ultimately means is we right now live in a global economy, in a global capitalist economy. The principal driver for a global capitalist economy is capital. So one of the things that you learn very quickly, particularly as an entrepreneur, is you learn that if you don't have capital, you cannot have capital, which means you cannot have capital, which means you cannot get capital. It's a bit of a vicious cycle that any entrepreneur finds themselves in. And what if you're an entrepreneur who has, a small burger stand? You want to sell hamburgers. Great, you have the best recipe. Everybody in town says your burgers are the best burgers that they've ever had. But how can you ever scale up beyond making the 6 burgers for your family? You need an injection of capital. And where do you get that capital? You can get it from friends and family, but A, that's inconsistent. B, they can charge rather usurious interest rates. What you want as an entrepreneur who wants to scale, who has ambitions, you want access to kind of market rate loans that are available, but you cannot access those if you have no access to financial services. So one of the things that Everex envisages itself doing beyond, okay, first step, let's provide e-wallet services to everybody so they can at least have access to immediate and interest and fee-free payments. Check. After we get them on board for that, now we can start collecting their data such that we can start understanding their payment patterns. As of today, credibility and credit worthiness is determined by some pretty old metrics that are kind of determined by the large credit-worthy companies. So we're talking about kind of most of them are Western-based. So you're talking about like Experian, companies like that. They use criteria that, again, were created in the West and don't necessarily apply to trustworthiness indicators that maybe the rest of the world uses. And that's particularly the case for 2 billion people who are excluded from this financial services. So what we want to do is start to collect data from those people who are excluded from financial services. What does this ultimately do? What this means is we can start determining, because ultimately what are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out if somebody's trustworthy. If I give you $5, I want to know that you're going to give me $5 back. If I give $5 to my sister, I know she's going to give it back to me. Okay, maybe not always the case, but yes, more than likely she's going to give it back to me because we know each other. But once you start going beyond your circle, beyond your familial circle, beyond your friend circle, beyond your family circle, it starts to get a bit, you have to start to get other indicators for trust. And when you start to look towards traditional metrics for gauging trust, like Experian, they don't apply to the experience of the 2 billion people excluded. So with that data, we're hoping to be able to determine new metrics for trustworthiness. And we're pretty confident that we can. We're definitely not alone in this endeavor. There are at least 10 other fintech companies right now, in addition to researchers, for example, at Harvard, at MIT, who have created alternative metrics for creditworthiness. And these are the type of metrics that we hope to integrate in order to be able to provide access to the key driver for economic growth, which is capital. And I think that's about it from me. Who I am, what we're doing. Right, the last part. What would I say to our investors? I know that so many of you, I know that during the course of our ICO, we really marketed this idea of financial exclusion, the end of financial exclusion. And I know that so many of our supporters have really believed in that as a mission. And just to let you know, that's the key reason why I joined the company, because I think that this is where the company can get to, and this is where we can really make that kind of difference and that kind of impact in a profit-driven way. So I would say, believe that we are very much actively working towards that. That I am working full-time principally on this financial inclusion portfolio, that I have a pretty sizable network in international NGOs and with the United Nations from my previous experience, and that I'm working quite closely with a lot of them, and hopefully partnerships will derive of that in the very near future. And that these things take work. Working with frontier markets always takes more work, but as long as you have dedication and you understand the entry points, that they are all within the realm of possibilities. So thanks again for supporting us, and get excited about this journey of onboarding 2 billion people who've hitherto not be onboarded. You're making a difference. Thanks.